Hello class, welcome to week 4 of INST 414. As we go through announcements for this week, we'll start with the Module 1 assignment. First, if you go look at the Module 1 assignments in the course Medium publication, you'll see that a number of students have submitted articles there. You can go check out and see what your fellow students have done, give you some good examples. The TA and I are working on evaluating these right now. So if you've gotten your Medium assignment submitted to the course publication within the past few days, you can expect to get grades back for them this week. Module 2, the Module 2 assignment is now available. It has been as of last week, so it's on graph analysis. Note that it is due the 25th. That's next Friday. This week we will talk about network centrality metrics, which will help you understand or identify important nodes in your graph. And last week we talked about how you can actually construct these graphs. So to that point, I have some new examples in the GitHub repo that you can check out for this that I'll talk about in a minute. Regarding the semester project, big thing about this week. So the feedback for your proposals is now available. You can go check all of this out in Elms. Go to your assignment. There should be a grade and a document. This is generally going to be a Word document with an associated grading rubric where I break down particular issues or areas where I think your proposal needs improvement or refinement. So as I mentioned, you can look here for the rubric. So that's going to tell you everything you need to know for your proposal revisions. Note, do not be too concerned about the grade at this stage. You can get back all the possible points that you need or any point that you lost on the proposal by addressing them in the proposal revisions. I'll give you some guidance here in a minute about what kind of revisions I'm looking for, but regardless of what your grade is, you can get back all the points you need or any points you lost by submitting these revisions. So let's talk about some of the biggest point deductions your So let's talk about the biggest places where people lost points here. So almost across the board, I took off points for the problem statement. This is one of the core places where a lot of people lost points. What I want you to do, and as I mentioned in previous lecture, the problem statement needs to identify a particular person and a decision that person needs to make and how you're going to support that decision in making, or how you're going to support that person in making that decision. This way, you can ensure that the insights you're generating, the insights you're extracting from your data or mining from your data are actionable. So the decision that these stakeholders need to make should lead to an action. Is this a house that I should buy? Is this a stock that I should sell? Is this a player that I should draft or pick up in my for my team? Do I need to, should I use this set of weapons for some build for my character when I play this particular game? You need to make sure that the insights are informing some particular action, because I will grade you about, or I'll evaluate your project based on the quality of these insights and whether you're communicating them effectively. It'll also help you a lot when you're thinking about how you evaluate whether your assignment is, or whether the models you're building for your project are useful or working well. Because if you don't have any way of knowing what kind of actions, what kind of downstream actions are being informed by your insights, it's going to make it very difficult for you to evaluate how well the models you're developing are actually performing. All right, so that's the first big thing. In your revision, you ought to identify explicitly. You're going to support this particular stakeholder. Is it a person who wants to buy a house in a particular area? Is it a player of a particular game? Is it a stock market analyst who wants to decide to buy or sell this particular asset? You want to identify that person and then describe the decision that person needs to make that your insights will inform. Then, for the data collection piece, I want you to explain what kind of data do you need for those insights. So what is the data? So if you're trying to understand something about restaurants in a local area, what kind of information is that? Are you looking at reviews? Are you looking at menu information? Are you looking at prices per product? If you're talking about stock market or stocks, are you talking about stock market prices over time? If you're talking about housing, is this rent information? Other features about housing like square feet or number of bedrooms, etc. Be explicit about what kind of data you want to get here. Now, I'm not asking you to go out and make sure that all of that data is available, but I do want you to be thinking about what kind of data, specifically what features of the data, what kind of information do I need to generate these insights. And then once you have that, is there an API that provides that for you? Do you expect to use some API for that? And if so, where might that API exist? Or do you expect to have to resort to scraping? So again, you don't have to have collected data here. That's not the point of the proposal, but you do need to have thought about or looked into, is there an API that gives me this data, or am I going to have to scrape it from someplace? If you're talking about Airbnb or like rental prices, Airbnb may not have an API for you. You may have to scrape data from there. If you're talking about fantasy football, there are probably some APIs that will give you some amount of fantasy football information. Are you going to be able to get that from the NCAA directly or from the NFL directly? It's unclear unless you're paying for those APIs. Maybe you have to resort to scraping there or use an API from some other place. I want you to have or to demonstrate that you've at least looked into and have some idea about what data you can use and whether it's available and how you get it. The next place people got points off as a common one is talking about the technology that you're going to use. So a core point here is you should say something about the languages you expect. That's useful information for me. But also, what kind of libraries do you anticipate using for this? If you're doing graph analysis, you're trying to understand like communities of people in social media, that's probably a NetworkX. You can use NetworkX for that, as you've seen in your examples. If you're talking about clustering or some kind of machine learning thing, then scikit-learn is a really good library for that. If you're using Python, again, I want you to demonstrate that you've thought about what kind of resources are out there to help you do these things. I'm not going to ask you to redevelop all kinds of machine learning models from scratch. I'm more interested in getting you to apply them, understand how they work, where they should be applied, what the math is behind them, and how you evaluate them. And there are almost certainly going to be libraries that will help you do that for whatever project you're going to use. Crucially, if you're saying you're going to use Excel and you're going to use Microsoft's database or MySQL or something, that's not enough here. Certainly Excel is not going to be enough for you to actually collect that data. You can't use Excel generally to collect or scrape data unless you're using some add-on. So if you're doing network analysis, maybe you added on NodeXL, which is totally fine, but you need to be specific that you're going to use NodeXL. You expect to use NodeXL to do data collection. So Excel alone is not going to be enough for the kind of analyses you need to be doing in this project. Similarly, visualization is not enough. So visualization is an important part of data mining, as we mentioned a couple weeks ago, but it is not the only part of data mining. You need to be able to extract insights and do some kind of analysis. And for this class in particular, I'm going to ask you to do things like clustering or some sort of supervised learning problem or some kind of regression in your project, and visualization is not going to be enough for that. That goes to my point before about obvious insights. So the last big point here is about insights. You want to make sure your insights are actionable. So that's why I'm asking you to identify a particular stakeholder and decision that that person needs to make. But you also want to make sure your insights are not obvious insights. So things like socioeconomic status drives health impacts or health outcomes in the United States. That's actually a pretty straightforward, well understood phenomenon. So to say that my insight is people who have lower socioeconomic status are likely to have worse COVID-19 outcomes is a very straightforward, unsurprising, relatively obvious insight from what we know about the world. For probably the vast majority of these kinds of questions, where I might tell you this is a pretty obvious insight, you can always tweak things to be a little bit more interesting or more sophisticated. So if you are trying to understand whether things like the weather impact car sales or impacts restaurants, like almost certainly when it's cold outside, people are not going to the zoo as much or something like that. So that's not a hugely interesting insight, but maybe you want to compare different sort of outdoor activities when it's cold. So if you are a company like The Nudge, where you want to provide people recommendations about activities to do on a particular day, which kind of activities are more likely to lead people to actually doing them or be useful or interesting to people given a particular weather system. Those, like, you can always tweak these kinds of insights to ask more interesting, less obvious or less intuitive questions. Also, in a number of these proposals, I saw that the problem statement that you outlined generally or was often not directly connected to the kind of insights you were looking for. So I want to make sure, or I want you to ensure in your proposals, the insights you're asking for or the insights that you expect to extract from your data are addressing the problem that you outline in your problem statement. Do they lead the stakeholder you're trying to support to some specific action? And then lastly, and this is a point here about the class, the main things we're going to use in this class, the main techniques that I'm teaching you, are about graph analysis, clustering, which we'll talk about today, regression analysis, supervised learning like classification. You need to use some of those techniques. Certainly you don't have to use all of them, but you need to use some of those techniques in your project. So regression is about scoring. Are you trying to score some risk, score the probability of some outcome? Classification is about like saying this kind of content gets this label, this kind of other content gets this other label. Clustering is, grouping things into separate clusters. Maybe you don't necessarily know what those clusters mean, but you can easily group them. We'll see that today, or we'll see that in the last bit of Module 2. We talk about clustering in graphs. Network analysis in graphs is going to be useful for identifying important people or nodes or places in an environment or a network setting. You want to be using some of those techniques in your project, because this project is supposed to be a way for you to explore them. You want to be using some of those techniques in your project, because this project is a semester-long project for a data mining course. The last point I'll make here is about use cases. One final point about use cases. When a number of you defined or described why this problem is important, many of you were saying things like, well, this is interesting, people could benefit from this. I need you to be more specific. What kind of real-world outcomes are being driven by your decision? What is the impact of the decision that a stakeholder may make based on the Our last point here is about use cases and the business use case. Why is this problem interesting or important? So I want you to explain not just why you think this is interesting or why this problem is interesting to you. You need to explain why this problem is important to your particular stakeholder. You should be thinking about this in terms of real-world outcomes, real-world impact. Given the decision that the stakeholder is trying to make, if your insight leads them to make one action over another, what are the potential outcomes or impacts of that decision? Often this is going to be, money. Are we saving money? Are we losing money? Is it prestige? Am I becoming more popular? Is it about, people's lives and health and safety? I need you to explain what kind of impact you expect your insights to be driving, because that's going to be the core motivation here, that your stakeholder has some problem. This problem is important because it impacts somebody's life, or it has impact on somebody's bank account. What are those impacts? Here at the iSchool, we're all about understanding, what is the connection between the information and the real world. This is where you make that connection clear. This is how you justify, this is why this problem is important, because it impacts someone's life. It impacts their life in a significant way. So you need to be specific. If you're saying all of society, or like everybody needs this, or all students need this, that's not enough. I want you to explain why it's important for your particular stakeholder. And generally you should think about this in terms of, is it going to make this stakeholder more money, lose money? Is it going to help them save someone's life, improve the livelihood of a particular population or audience, what have you? I need you to be specific here. So do not say, the main motivation for this problem is that it is interesting to me. I've said numerous times throughout the lecture that is insufficient. You need to explain why it is interesting, why it is important to your stakeholder, and what the real world impacts of the decisions you're helping them make really are. So you can use all of those insights, or everything that I just described there, and whatever comments I provided you in your rubric, to get back any points you lost. For the vast majority of you, I tried to provide a specific set of guidances, like how can you tweak your particular problem, what might an example stakeholder and decision be. If you are still confused about that, do reach out to me. If you're not clear about how you can tweak your proposal into something that fits what I've just described, that's fine. Come to office hours or schedule an appointment with me, and you'll be able to get all your points back. The proposal piece is really important at the beginning of your project, because all the rest of your project, I want you to have a useful and productive and educational project here. So the foundation that you get in your proposal, what you're driving towards, is really important. It's going to help you identify, what data do I need? How important is, this model versus that model? It's going to help you make choices down the road for your data collection process, for your interim report, all these things. Knowing or having a solid foundation here with your proposal is going to help you in all of those places. Okay. A couple of things that I've added to help support with the modules and the assignments. So I've added a couple of exercises to the to your GitHub repository that I want to outline here. So the Medium articles are your opportunities to explore some specific technique in a set of data that you care about or you find as interesting. For the exercises, these are particular exercises that I have answers for, so you can see how I might solve this problem. So the two exercises, the first one is about finding frequent groups of actors in IMDb. This is an example or an exercise to get you to use the techniques from frequent item set mining. And the second exercise is about random walks in IMDb graphs or actor graphs. This exercises some of the techniques behind graph building and around the centrality metrics that we will talk about. So the first exercise is to find frequent pairs of actors in IMDb. If you go to GitHub, there's a new data folder that has a JSON file that actually I will probably use for many of these projects, or many of these exercises rather. And what I want you to do is try and find frequently occurring pairs with some support threshold of 0.01. Then, print what the most frequent pairs are. And then I want you to relax that threshold a little bit lower, reprint, and then find frequently occurring triples. So when we talked about frequent item set mining in the past, I mentioned or described how the support threshold that you get for pairs is going to be generally much higher than the support threshold for triplets, because triplets are much more rare than, or frequent triplets are much more rare than frequent pairs. The second exercise, the graph example, using the same data, construct an undirected graph of actors based on co-star roles. So the IMDb data is a bunch of movies that contain top billed actors, genres, and movie titles and years. And I want you to connect actors based on whether they starred in movies together. Just doing that will give you some insight about, or give you an example about graph building. Then I want you to explore some random walks in the graph, and that will help you get a feel for what PageRank really is doing. So these last 3 points: select a random actor from the graph, randomly walk to the 10th node from that actor. Do this a number of times, counting where you end up. And then you should be able to compare the frequent endpoints for your random walk to the PageRank metric that we've talked about last week. So, as I mentioned, all of this is in an updated version of the GitHub repo. You can see the frequent pairs exercise in Module 1 and the graphs exercise in the Module 2 folder. And the data folder now has the IMDb data for you. All right, so those are all the announcements for where we are. For next week, we'll start Module 3, talking about similarity and clustering, or rather talking about similarity, which will set up how we do clustering. So in particular, I want you to read a few sections in Chapter 3 of MMDS, 3.1 through 3.5. It's paying particular attention to sections 3.1 and 3.2 and 3.5. So 3.3 and 3.4 are about dimensionality reduction, so min hashing and locality-sensitive hashing. So I will go through some of the math there so you get that foundation of how we can use hashing to help address the large or the big data problem that we have when we have very large data sets. But sections 3.1 and section 3.1 will introduce similarity, which is going to be useful when we talk about distance metrics in 3.5. All right, so for next week, when we start Module 3 on similarity, the similarity for next week, we're going to start Module 3 on similarity, dimensionality reduction, and hashing. So this will set the stage for clustering and unsupervised learning. So it's important that you get some foundation here. To do that, I want you to read through Chapter 3 of MMDS, specifically sections 3.1 through 3.5. Pay particular attention to 3.1, 3.2, and 3.5. So sections 3.1 and 3.5 are about distance and similarity. Those are the core pieces that I want you to understand. Section 3.2 is about shingling, which is great if you're trying to do anything around natural language processing or text processing for your project. So that gives you a good example about how you deal with vocabulary questions in simple ways. If you want to do more sophisticated things with language models or words, there's lots of ways you can expand on that you can explore in natural language processing courses. 3.2 is a good example of how to deal with text for now. 3.3 and 3.4 are more mathy sections about how we deal with large-scale data and do dimensionality reduction. So the math in 3.3 and 3.4 I'll go over next week, but you don't have to understand those as much as I want you to understand 3.1, 3.5, and 3.2. All right, remember assignment 2 for graph analysis is due next Friday. You should be able to get some insight about what you could do for this using the exercise and the answer for the exercise that I've provided you in GitHub. And do get your proposal revisions in to me as soon as possible. So those will get your points back, and that'll give you the revisions that you need to do for your data collection report, which is due in a few weeks, where you demonstrate that you've made progress in actually collecting data here. All right, if you have any questions about any of this, about your project proposals or anything related to the module assignments, reach out to me. You can go to my email. Or you can send me a note in Elms, or you can drop by office hours for me or for Tanishq.